The name of a place can become a curse, a brand seared onto the map by an atrocity so profound it eclipses everything that came before. This is the story of how a small, unassuming suburb in South Australia became synonymous with the depths of human depravity, and how the whispers of a few desperate men led police to a discovery so horrifying it would forever be known as the bodies in the barrels murders. Our story doesn't begin with the killers, but with the victims. To understand the tragedy, you must first understand the world in which it festered. This is the northern outskirts of Adelaide in the 1990s, a landscape of economic despair, of housing trust homes with peeling paint and sun-scorched lawns. It's a world of fractured families, petty crime, and profound, aching vulnerability. People like Clinton Trezise, a young man with a gentle soul but a life tangled in drugs and aimlessness. Or Ray Davies, a drifter who loved his mother and struggled with his own demons. They were not saints, but they were sons, brothers, friends. They were people who, one by one, began to vanish from the fabric of their community, their absences noted with a shrug by a world accustomed to seeing people drift away. Into this world of vulnerability stepped John Bunting. He wasn't a monster from a nightmare. He was something far more insidious, a charismatic, manipulative man who presented himself as a vigilante. With his broad shoulders, close-cropped hair, and easy, confident smile, he positioned himself as a protector. He spoke of cleaning up the streets, of ridding the community of scum, his catch-all term for pedophiles, drug dealers, and anyone he deemed morally unfit. People were drawn to his forceful personality. He offered a sense of purpose and belonging to those who felt powerless. One of those drawn into his orbit was Robert Wagner, a quieter, more submissive man who looked at Bunting with something close to worship. Another was Mark Haydon, a seemingly ordinary neighbor. And then there was James Vlassakis, a teenager whose fractured family life made him desperately susceptible to Bunting's dark influence. Bunting became a surrogate father to him, a relationship that would warp into something unspeakable. The first to disappear was Clinton Trezise in 1992. Bunting told people Clinton had moved interstate. The lies were smooth, believable. Then it was Ray Davies in 1995. The pattern was subtle, a slow bleed of lives from a community that was already bleeding. Bunting's rhetoric grew bolder, more violent. He kept detailed, handwritten lists, ranking people with codes and symbols, a macabre ledger of who he deemed worthy of death. He spoke of his killings not as murders, but as executions, a necessary culling. His home on Waterloo Corner Road became the epicenter of this horror, and it was here, in the backyard, that the first black plastic barrel appeared. The investigation was a slow, grinding puzzle with most of the pieces missing. Families reported their loved ones missing, but these were people who lived transient lives. Police resources were limited, and leads went cold. For years, the whispers about John Bunting were just that, whispers. He was clever, careful, and he preyed on those society was quick to forget. The break, when it finally came, was not from a direct murder investigation, but from a separate, gruesome discovery in May 1999. Police were called to a disused bank vault in the tiny town of Snowtown, over 90 miles north of Adelaide. The new tenants had been complaining of a sickening, overwhelming smell. What they found inside would become one of the most chilling crime scenes in Australian history. The air in the vault was thick and foul, a physical presence that coated the back of the throat. In the gloom, detectives saw 6 large plastic barrels lined up against a wall. As the lids were pried off, the true nightmare was revealed. The barrels were not filled with rubbish or industrial waste. They were filled with human remains. 8 bodies, dismembered and pickled in acid, were stuffed inside. The identification process was a forensic hell. But one name emerged that sent a direct and terrifying line back to Adelaide's northern suburbs, John Bunting. He was known to be an associate of one of the victims found in the vault. The Snowtown Murders had a name, and the investigation exploded. Detectives descended on Bunting's social circle, and the carefully constructed world of lies began to crumble. Robert Wagner, under intense pressure, started to talk. Then James Vlassakis, now a young man trapped in a prison of his own trauma, began to confess. The story he told was beyond any detective's worst imaginings. The killings had not happened in Snowtown. The vault was merely a storage locker, a final, desperate attempt to hide the evidence. The real House of Horrors was Bunting's former home on Waterloo Corner Road. Vlassakis, his voice hollow, described a world of unimaginable cruelty. Victims were lured to the house under false pretenses. A party, a place to stay, a friendly drink. Once inside, they were tortured for days. Bunting and Wagner derived pleasure from the suffering, taunting their captives, playing psychological games. They used cables, knives, and their bare hands. They recorded some of the torture sessions on audio tape, their own casual, laughing voices a stark contrast to the screams of agony in the background. The barrels were brought in after the murders, a practical, monstrous solution for body disposal. The acid was meant to dissolve the evidence, to reduce human beings to nothing. But it hadn't worked fast enough. The most devastating revelation of all came from Vlassakis. Through tearful, halting testimony, he confessed that his own stepbrother, David Johnson, was one of the victims. Bunting, his surrogate father, had not only forced him to participate in the torture and murder of others, but had then guided him in the killing of his own family member. It was the ultimate act of psychological destruction, designed to bind Vlassakis to him in shared, irrevocable guilt. The vigilante facade was gone, revealing the truth. A sadistic, psychopathic predator who used morality as a weapon to justify his own bloodlust. The trial of John Bunting was a media spectacle, a grim procession of horror into a sterile courtroom. The prosecution laid out its case with methodical, devastating precision. They played the tapes. The courtroom fell silent, the air sucked out by the sound of Bunting's calm, conversational tone juxtaposed with the raw, human sounds of suffering. A juror wept. Others stared straight ahead, as if trying to distance themselves from the audio. Bunting, representing himself, showed no remorse. He cross-examined witnesses, including Vlassakis, with a cold, arrogant disdain, trying to paint himself as the victim of a conspiracy. But the evidence was a mountain he could not climb. The barrels, the tapes, the testimony of his accomplices, and his own meticulous lists formed an incontestable portrait of a serial killer. The climax of the trial was not a single piece of evidence, but the overwhelming weight of it all, the sheer, industrial scale of the cruelty. The jury returned with 11 guilty verdicts for murder. The judge, in sentencing him to life in prison with no possibility of parole, told Bunting he was at the absolute top of the scale of serial killers. Robert Wagner and Mark Haydon were also convicted for their roles, their sentences ensuring they would never walk free. James Vlassakis, for his cooperation and his own status as a victim, received a lesser sentence. The town of Snowtown, an innocent bystander to the evil, has spent decades trying to shed the name that now evokes only one terrible thing. The story of the bodies in the barrels is not just a tally of victims and killers. It is a cautionary tale about the banality of evil, about how a monster can hide in plain sight, cloaking himself in the guise of a righteous crusader. It is about the fragility of community and the devastating consequences when vulnerability is exploited by a master manipulator. The barrels, meant to erase all traces, instead became eternal, grotesque monuments to the lives stolen, a permanent stain on the Australian psyche. It is a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones who hide in the shadows, but the ones who smile at you from across the street. If stories like this keep you hooked, hit subscribe for more.